Since we have few new faces this morning, so we want to make sure that we understand the basic definitions before we go to the Mishnah on page 20. There is a concept we call ייבום. ייבום is a Levirate marriage. And there is another one that is called וחליצה, meaning when a man refuses to redeem the soul of his brother, the deceased, he can go ahead and release the wife of the deceased by acting in a manner it's called וחליצה. Short elaboration, we explain in the past several days that in Leviticus 18 the Torah gives us a long list of arayot. Remember this word because I'm going to use it a lot. It's called Isur Erva. Erva, Ain Reish Vav Hei, meaning it's anyone that comes in that list of abomination, such as relation between father and daughter, and more, any blood relatives that have some sort of relation is in the list of abomination. One of them is a prohibition against relation between a man and the wife of his brother. By the same token, the Torah tells us in Deuteronomy 25 that in a case of two brothers, we call them for our discussion Reuven and Shimon. Reuven passed young, Shimon, the surviving brother of the deceased, have the mitzvah, have the obligation, the commandment to redeem the soul of the deceased, meaning the deceased left this world childless, by marrying the wife of the deceased, and in this way he will be able to perpetuate the soul of the deceased. We don't talk mysticism, but it's the idea that the soul remain in a family, meaning it's a continuation of the deceased soul by having the spirit of the soul continue within the form of the family. By the same token, the Torah tells us that this fellow, which we call Yavam, Yavam meaning the brother Shimon, who have the mitzvah to redeem the soul of the deceased Reuven, he had the right also to refuse, meaning he needs to act in a manner which is called וחליצה, releasing the widow, let's call her Rachel, the wife of the deceased Reuven, by acting in a certain form of ritual, as we discussed several times, removing the shoe, etc. In that way, she is now free to go ahead and marry whoever she wished to. The next step we understand so far, there is a concept that's called zika. Zika is some type of bond between the two entities, meaning between Rachel and Shimon. The moment that there is a potential of marriage, there is a disputation between the rabbis if that potential of marriage put them in a situation of bonding, meaning since Reuven since Shimon potentially married Rachel, and Rachel potentially will be the wife of Shimon, does that mean that there is a zika bond, that there is some magnetism, some correlation between the two entities? Or you may say that still, since is no really act of husband and wife, therefore there is no commitment. We discuss further the question of ma'amar, which means Shimon shows some intent to go ahead and marry her. Is that intent, again, put them in a situation of zika, meaning it's potential house, marriage, or not? Especially if while Shimon intend to maybe marry Rachel, is another brother just born, which we call Levi. And now the question is how we treated Levi if Shimon, while in the process of maybe marry Rachel, passed. Furthermore, we discussed the issue of a rival, meaning if there is another woman involved here, which is the wife of Shimon, and now Reuven and Shimon both no longer among the living, is Levi have an obligation, mitzvah or prohibition, involved with the wife of Reuven, the deceased, and the wife of Shimon, again, for our case, is deceased, especially since Shimon shows some intent to marry the wife of Reuven, and that was our discussion so far. And we explained that we have two contradicted concepts. One, it's called Isurei Arayot, Erva, remember this word, which is prohibition, such as prohibition, one of the least, against marrying the wife of the brother. By the same token, we have in Deuteronomy 25 a mitzvah, a commandment to marry the wife of the brother. And we explained the interchange between those two entities in many different variations. But now we go to the next step, which is, since we explained that the wife of the brother, who's no longer among the living, is a question of Isurei Erva, it's a question of one of the list of the Arayot, of prohibition. Why is that? Because Levi came to this world, the third brother, while Reuven is a deceased. You remember the case? We said, for example, I'm Israeli, so it's easy to refer to that. If it's a young man, a young soldier, got married, he's at his early 20s, and then he passed, he get killed, and he had a brother, right? And the brother married with no children, and he was about to marry the wife of the deceased, we call her Rachel, and the parents were still young, of both two brothers, have another child, Levi, but Levi was born after Reuven get killed. So if Shimon is no longer among the living, the wife of Reuven, Rachel, is under the prohibition of Erva, because Levi came to this world after Reuven is a deceased. So the moment he's a deceased, we are back to old business, which is one of the list of prohibition in Leviticus 18. And because of that, we enter the domain of the next question, is the wife of Shimon considering Tzarat Erva, which means the rival of one of those of the prohibition. Why it's called a rival? Because these two wives, wife of Reuven, Rachel, and for our discussion, wife of Shimon, let's call it Tamar, Rachel and Tamar, they are rivals to each other because they are wife of different husbands for our discussion. Yet, Rachel lost her husband while Levi was not born. Tamar lost her husband while Levi is around. So therefore, we ask a question how we treated the wife of Shimon, Tamar. And that was the discussion so far. But we understand another concept, which is וחליצה, which by the way it's applied to this day. Meaning, today the chief rabbinate of Israel said, which we discussed several times, there is a concept we're going to study on page 39, Abba Shaul concept. You remember that? Hey, hoo-hoo. You remember that concept? Okay. Page 39 tells us the concept of Abba Shaul, which is very important. Abba Shaul came in and he said, look, wait a second. You remember the story in Genesis about Yehuda, Judah, that have 3 sons, and Tamar was the wife of the oldest son, Er, and Er passed, and then Onan act even before giving the Torah. In the Levirate married Tamar, but he married Tamar for her beauty, and as a result, the Torah said he put the semen, the sperm in the ground, and makes God angry, and God took his life. You remember that? In the book of Genesis, I think it's chapter 38. So the point is, 28 or 38? Anyway, so the point is you have here a situation of a brother, Onan, who married Tamar, the wife of the deceased heir, for her beauty. So Abba Shaul came in and said, wait, since the Torah specified a long list of arayot, a long list of abominations, and one of them is the wife of the brother, we need to examine the intent of the living, surviving brother. And if the brother's intent is beauty, money, fame, right? Married to Elizabeth Taylor, I'm joking, right? Anything that it's not a pure intent for perpetuating the soul of the deceased and have it within the framework of a family, which we call mitzvah, a commandment, we turn around and said it's a abomination, it's a prohibition. You can't do that. You are in violation. And therefore the chief rabbinate of Israel came in and said, since in the modern days we assume, we can't say all, but many of the men, M-E-N, right, does not have the pure intent of marrying the wife of the deceased for the sake of perpetuating the soul, therefore we put the boundaries. We cannot allow at this point to have an act of ייבום, of act of levirate marriage. By the same token, there are Sephardi community that does that, and the chief rabbinate required to have וחליצה. So it means, to this very day, you see a manner of וחליצה, meaning releasing the wife of the deceased to go ahead and marry outside of the family to whoever she wished to, by doing this symbolic act of וחליצה, by this act of release. Now here we are with that concept of וחליצה and ייבום, and we ask a question, is that connected to each other or not? The Mishnah tells us, page 20, כלל אמרו ביבמה, כל שהיא איסור ערווה, לא חולצת ולא מתייבמת, Rashi said, צרתה וכל שכן היא. We have two entities. One is called איסורי לאו, and one is called איסורי כרת. כרת, meaning the Torah tells us, if you do that, that soul shall be cut off. Very strong, right? Via negativa, strong punishment. There is love. Love meaning is a negative commandment. It is a negative commandment, but in that manner, we treat it more lenient. So here is the general principle. The general principle, the sages said, in a matter of Yevamah, anyone who is prohibited to the Yavam because of erva, remember the word erva, I'm going to use it now a lot, okay, she neither have וחליצה nor have ייבום, and here we talk about the rival, and for sure Rashi said she herself, and therefore איסור מצווה ואיסור קדושה. What does that mean? Since we said kol she'isurea isur erva, Tosfot tells us, which means anyone at the category of erva, of the abomination, so therefore soon you see we have a concept, it's called isur mitzvah, which is prohibited by mitzvah, and isur kedusha. Soon you see the explanation. Choletzet velo mityabemet. Remember we said in the introduction, in a practical manner, that the chief rabbinate of Israel required act of וחליצה, not ייבום, but וחליצה, release, achota, the sister of the erva, shehi mityabemet, which means that she was married to the brother of her husband of that erva, choletzet or mityabemet. It's an option, meaning you have Reuven and Shimon, the two brothers. They are brothers. They marry two sisters, Rachel and Leah. Now, Levi came in later to the picture, the third brother. So therefore they have issue of וחליצה and ייבום. And we said, since it's a situation פגיעה באחות זקוקתו, because each of them it's in a way a rival to the others, and therefore he needs to release both of them. And then we elaborate in the Mishnah and said, Isur mitzvah, the prohibition by mitzvah, shniyot midivrei sofrim. Sofrim, meaning the rabbis, the Gemarrah in Tractate Kiddushin, page 30, tells us that the rabbinic prohibition, it's called sofrim, meaning scribe, meaning rabbis, they put another boundary that is called shniyot le'arayot, the second degree of relation, which is to put a boundary from erva, from the arayot. Who are they? We're going to study the next daf on page 21, 22, a list of them. Example, mother of the mother, mother of the father, etc. It's a book in halakha called Darkei Moshe, in Even HaEzer, Siman Tet Zayin, chapter 15. He come and medayek mehatur, he explains that if you have a manner of kiddushin, manner of betrothal in the shniyot, in the second level of arayot, it's an issue. Why? Because you have the second person who act in a manner of kiddushin, and it's basically rabbinic violation by marrying that one. So he asks a question: how come second degree of betrothal of kiddushin carries more stringent than a biblical prohibition of erva? And there is a book written by Rabbi Shmuel Rozovsky, the great Rosh Yeshiva. He explains that when it's come to the level of shniyot, the second degree, that basically sholelet kiddushin midrabanan. The moment that you enter the domain of the arayot, of the abomination, that automatically they annul the rabbinic manner of betrothal. Next step, it's Isur Kedusha. Isur Kedusha, the term prohibited because of sanctity. What does that involve? Almana lekohen gadol. The Torah tells us that if a brother of a high priest passed childless, she cannot marry a high priest, because the Torah prohibited a high priest to marry a widow. But since still she is his sister-in-law, he needs to do what? He needs to act in a וחליצה. The Kohen Gadol need to release her. Why? Because her prohibition is only rabbinic, and the ייבום, the act of levirate, is biblical. Therefore, it's a manner of requirement for him to release her. גרושה וחלוצה לכהן אדיוט. A regular priest, a regular Kohen, prohibited by Torah law to marry a divorcee, or chalutza, the wife was released from a previous marriage. The Gemara later explains that the assumption of marriage is cohabitation, thank you. And therefore, because it's in that manner, Kohen have the biblical obligation to marry virgin. So the next one, mamzeret untina leYisrael. We have another category, which is an illegitimated female child, or netina, to a regular Israel, which again, this is either a child that come out of violation, bi'at erva. For example, someone have illicit relation with one of the family members, and as a result you have a child. Biblical example, Lot and his daughters, okay, in the cave, right? So therefore the child is illegitimate, or someone, the Mishnah going to tell us in 49, who was born to that illegitimate child. So therefore, it's a violation of negative commandment in Deuteronomy 23. Ubat Israel enatinu mamzer, and the Israelite daughter to the same manner, natin or mamzer, illegitimate child. So she cannot act in a manner of receiving Levirate marriage. By the same token, she must have a וחליצה the same manner as the previous case of mamzeret and netina leYisrael. Gemarrah asks a question, klal la'atuyei mai. When you give me a general principle, as you remember, one of the 13 principles of Rabbi Ishmael, it means that there are specifications that comes out of a general principle. Amar Afram bar Papa, remember this rabbi? He's one of the list of the 10 rabbis who mentioned in every completion of tractates. He said, la'atuyei tzarat ailonit u'kederav asi. Was a great explanation we have previously on page 12, you remember, is a case of a woman that she cannot have children. And a man had 2 wives. The first one is Ailonit, and the second one is a regular wife, but it's considering co-wife or rival wife for our discussions. So she do not have neither וחליצה, not ייבום. Why? Because that Ailonit considering erva, and therefore that's what the Torah said. The Torah used the word asher teled, which means if she is Ailonit, she cannot bear children. Poteret tzarata, she is basically examined the other one, the co-wife, from acting in a manner neither וחליצה nor ייבום. So that is the subsequent order, the prat, the principle, the come out of that principle.
The specification.
Thank you, the specification. And the Ika de Amrei, there are those who explain the concept of klal, of principle, in a Mishnah, kol she'isura isur herva hu de asira tzarata. Anyone that is under the category of erva, automatically the rival, the koa, is prohibited. Ha lo isura isur erva, tzarata lo asira. She is not, the other one is not prohibited from ייבום. למאותי מאי, אמר אפרם למאותי צרת אילונית ודלא כרב אסי. He does not hold what Rav Asi told us. Remember page 12? And basically he said that Tzarat Ailonit, the co-wife of Ailonit, is not considering Tzarat Erva. Achota shehi Yevimta, the Mishnah said that the sister that she is Yevimta, she have to do one of the two, either one, Choletzet or Mityabemet. So we ask a question, Achota deman, which one referring to the sister? Ilema isu mitzvah, which means that one of the level of shniyot. Remember we said shniyot, the second level, mother of the mother, etc. Kevan de oraita ramya kamei, since biblically speaking she is falling in the category of ייבום, so paga be'achot zekukato, so he is basically connected to whom? To the sister of his biblical zkuka. So she cannot, you can't tell me that she's permitted to have ייבום with him. Ela, you have to say achota de isur erva, that she is the sister of one which is prohibited to him because of the prohibition of erva. So therefore, or choletzet or mityabemet. Isur mitzvah shniyot. We explain the Mishnah that the prohibition by mitzvah applies to the divrei sofrim, that the rabbinic prohibition of arayot. Amai kare le isur mitzvah. Why you call it in that language, Isur, prohibited of mitzvah? Amar Abaye, mitzvah lishmoa ledivrei chachamim. The Torah tells us in Deuteronomy chapter 17 that each generation have their own teachers, their own leaders. And therefore, you can't tell me, oh, the one who lived in the past are more important or more authoritative than the current. This is the one you have now. You have to listen to them. Even the Torah said it tell you left to right or right to left. You have to listen to them. So therefore, it's a special commandment to listen and to follow, and that's applied to a special boundary that the rabbis come in, which is shniyot, the second degree of abomination of arayot, which again, examples, mother of the mother, mother of the father. We're going on page 21 and 2 to elaborate on those shniyot la'arayot midei rabbanan, by the rabbinic level. Isur Kedusha, the next one we said in the Mishnah is prohibited because of sanctity. This applied to what? Widow almana lekohen gadol, grusha וחליצה לכהן הדיוט. The Mishnah said, מה עיקר אלוהו איסור קדושה? דכתיב קדושים יהיו לאלוהיהם. The Torah said in Leviticus chapter 21 in Parashat Emor that women are prohibited to the Kohanim. It's called Isur Kedusha. So therefore, we have Lav Chayavei Lavin, that it's in a negative commandment, but it's not involved with the karet, punishment. So that, Tosfot Yontov said, the Mishnah incorporated them with those prohibited to the Kohanim, because they are connected to the sanctity lineage of our nation. Tanya Rabbi Yehuda Machlif, איסור מצווה אלמנה לכהן גדול, גרושה וחלוצה לכהן אידיוט, ומה עיקר לאיסור מצווה? דכתיב אלה המצוות. So that's what's written at the end in the book of Vayikra, chapter 27, that applies to אלמנה, to כהן גדול, גרושה וחלוצה לכהן אידיוט. איסור קדושה שניות מדברי סופרים. ואמר קרא לאיסור קדושה, אמר רביי, כל המקיים דברי חכמים נקרא קדוש. Anyone who followed the path of the sages is considering holy. אמר לרבה, וכל שאינו מקיים דברי חכמים קדוש ולא מקרה רשע, למה לא מקרה? Pick and choose. Either you tell me that it's a person is holy that follow the leadership of the sages, is considering holy, or that person is in violation. Pick and choose. So he said that the manner of kadosh in Leviticus 19 applies to that person. But we elaborate and say that Amarav kadesh atzmecha bamutar lach. So in the book, The Path for the Righteous, Mesilat Yesharim, at the beginning of chapter 13, he explains that there are certain concepts that you can find a manner that is not biblical, and you said, come on, this is rabbis made, but this is the beauty that you have to take those seriously. So when it's come to the Kedusha, it's called Tosefet al Arayot, which means this is an addition to a regular list of abomination in the Torah, such as when the rabbis came in and said mother of the mother or mother of the father, etc. That's something that the person have to accept upon himself, and therefore that make him a holy kadosh. The Maharsha elaborates, and the Maharsha said, takes for example the Nazir, the Nazirite. He basically an average person who can drink wine. He accepts upon himself the prohibition of Nazirite by avoiding himself from drinking wine. So that's called Kadesh Atzmecha. You sanctify yourself Bamutar lach, in something that you basically allow to do, but you sanctify yourself by refraining from something that it's permitted to you. The Mishnah said, Almana lekohen gadol, kapasik vetane. So you see here something that looks like an absolute. You remember Louis XIV? Right? Absolute. So it means that there's no circumstance the high priest can have any matter of ייבום with the widow. לא שנה מן הנישואין ולא שנה מן האירוסין. which is, what do you understand? There is a process. You remember we talked lehavdil in the Indian culture. You have a lot of manner of bethrowing before you have total act of cohabitation. Thank you. So, the question is, since it's a matter of engagement, you ask a question, and if that man passed, is his brother, who is for our case is a high priest, have anything to do with her? So bishlama min hanisuim aseh velo ta'aseh. If you tell me that it's marriage, so that clearly the Torah said in Leviticus 21, prohibited. That's obvious. And for sure, if it's applied to the Kohen, regular Kohen that needs to have a virgin, here you talk about the high priest, right? But he said, ve'ein aseh dochelo ta'aseh va'aseh. So they said, the moment that she's married, it's called bechezkat be'ula. We assume that they already have a cohabitation between the two. All right?
So in general, the Kohen them are exempt from doing levirate marriage. Because they can.
It's not so simple, because we're just discussing the stages of marriage. What are you considering marriage? Engagement is a marriage or not? And another phase to that is, which soon we're going to discuss, is levirate marriage involved with the act of releasing, וחליצה, or is it two separate entities? We are not there yet. Anyway.
Does anyone consider zika to be any form of a marriage bond, or not?
We just discussed it before yesterday. It's in a matter. It's not a marriage.
I mean, there's a bond, but it's not considered. I mean, it's not.
Depending in some manners, it's considering a marriage, because it's an act of commitment between the two. She cannot go ahead.
It's like a betrothal.
Sort of. And the question is, if it's betrothal, even you may say that it's not a cohabitation, but it's still a matter of commitment. Anyway, ela mina erusin. It's only at the time of the first stage of engagement. Lo ta'aseh greidau. This is basically a negative commandment. Lo ta'aseh, regular one, and it doesn't have that strength, that stringencies. Sabah al-khayr akhuya. Yavo aseh ve'idche lo ta'aseh. Right? So you have here a positive commandment, and therefore it's override the negative commandment of marrying almana to Kohen Gadol. So the Gemara responded and said, Amar Rav Gidel Amar Rava, Amar Kra, the Torah said in regard to וחליצה in Deuteronomy 25, Ve'alta yevimto hasha'ara. His yevama shall ascend to the gate for the purpose of וחליצה. שאין תלמוד לומר יבמתו. מה תלמוד לומר יבמתו? יש לך יבמה אחת שעולה לחליצה ואינה עולה לייבום, ואיזו? זו חייבי loving. As we explained, there are two categories. One is loving, which is a negative commandment. One is correct. So the moment she is under the domain of חייבי loving, she come for the וחליצה, but not for ייבום. It's in a way it resonates the current event, the current situation that, as we explained earlier, that in Israel even we don't practice ייבום, we do practice וחליצה because it's a question of חייבי loving. Next, ואימה חייבי כריתות, you may say that that's the much higher level, which is something that prohibited by the penalty of karet, that soul shall be cut off, and teaches that they too require וחליצה even though they are ineligible for ייבום. אמר קרא, ואם לא יחפוץ האיש לקחת, meaning the man did not wish to act in a levirate manner. החפץ מייבם, if he wish, he can act in a levirate marriage. כל העולה לייבום עולה לחליצה, וכל שאינה עולה לייבום אינה עולה לחליצה. That's a very important principle. Now the idea is, if she have a potential for levirate, therefore if that potential not fulfilled, she needs to have a manner of release. But if it's not even a potential for ייבום, is no need to וחליצה. Example, חייבי כריתות. So, it's not לא עולה לייבום, and therefore לא עולה לחליצה. So the Gemarrah challenged that. He said, יחי חייבי להבין נמי. So this manner you should go also to those who are prohibited by the negative commandment. They also should be excluded from חליצה as well as ייבום. So the Gemara said, הרבי רחמנה יבמתו. The Torah, Rahmana is the expression of merciful one. The Torah, it's superfluous, the term Yevamah in the latter part of the verse. So the Gemara, so even she's not befitting for ייבום, so she need Chalitza or Mara'ita. So the question is why you have this manner of thinking that those Chayavei Kritut is part of the those who have the penalty of karet. That's the one that have the mi'ut of chalitza, and the others, the very loving, those who are under the penalty of negative commandment. You may say the opposite way. You should say that that those of a negative commandment should be the mi'ut, and those who have the kritut, it should be the ribui. 20b, mistabra. It is reasonable. Why? Chayavei lavin tafse beu kiddushin, chayavei kritot lo tafse beu kiddushin. I wish to have more time, but I'm just giving you a vignette of the Ritva. The Ritva explained to us that there are three categories of Yevamot. The first category is Yevamah that permitted to the Avam, and she is part of which the Torah called lakachat, to be part, to acquire, and she's come up for both, for ייבום and Chalitza. That's the simple literal understanding of the text. There is another one that is Yevamah that prohibited to the Avam by the karet penalty, and that karet penalty you cannot have the manner of lakachat, and therefore she cannot be neither ייבום nor Chalitza. And number three, that she is prohibited to that Yavam with the Isur Lav, with the negative commandment that's not involved karet penalty, he can do partially lakachat, and therefore she can have the Chalitza, even she's not befitting for the ייבום. So Mativ Rava challenged it and said Isur mitzvah, which is rabbinic prohibition, right? Ve'isur kedusha, prohibited by the sanctity. Ba'alea, if the Avam cohabited with her, or chalatzla niftera tzarata, the other wife is exempt. The moment is an act of levirate, the other woman is out of the picture. If you tell me that biblically speaking it's only come to the category of release chalitza, but it's not come for ייבום, so how come the rival, the co-wife, is exempt from all of that? Because that relation is not considering an effect. So they said hu motiv la v'mefarek la. The question you ask, it's basically the answer. The answer is litzdadim ktanei. We talk about separate cases that we mentioned in the close. Ba'alea aisur mitzvah, chalatzla aisur kedusha. If he cohabited with her, referred to the what? The prohibition by rabbinic law. If it's a chalitza, it's prohibited because of the negative commandment, the idea of the sanctity. Mativ Rava, ptsua daka uchut shafra. You have here cases of a man that have a physical issues, such as you have crushed testicles and have a severe organ, severed organ, or all kind of sris adam, a person who's series by the act of man, and it's one who's sterile, right, etc. So in those cases, what do you do? The hazaken, elderly person that cannot have children, if you have this Yevamah, or Choltzim or Meyabmim, either one. Keitzad, give me an example. Metu velahem achim, if they passed and they have brothers. Velahem nashim, and those who passed surviving wife. Ve'amdu achim ve'asu ma'amar bin shotehem, and those brothers came and act in a manner of intent with the wives. Ve'natnu get, so I explain in my book, Biurei klomar berashi al hashas. There is a Rashi here. Rashi said, ve'natnu get, klomar, o natnu o chaltzu. So Rashi based on something we're going to study on page 79b, that you may think that it's both act of ma'amar, which means act of intent, and act of get. And he said that no, either one. But you're welcome, I wrote a lot on this, you're welcome to read more in my book. So they said vechaltzu, ma she'asu asu, which means you see it a lot in rabbinic writing, that even something happened in the manner of violation or incorrect behavior, you still considering by the law as an effective marriage or an effective act of release. Ve'im ba'alu kanu, but if they have an act of manner of cohabitation, they already, for our understanding, is a manner of acquiring them in a manner of levirate marriage. Metu achim, if the brothers are no longer among the living, ve'amdu hem, and those physically incapable brothers, ve'asu ma'amar bin shotehem, and they act in a manner of intent to marry those surviving wives, ve'natnu get, and they give a bill of divorce, or shechaltzu, or they act in a manner of releasing those women. Ma she'asu asu, it's after the fact, by force of circumstance. V'im ba'alu kanu, the moment they have a manner of cohabitation, they basically have a manner of acquisition, they acquire it. Ve'asu lekaiman, yet they have an issue of that marriage. Why? Because the Torah tells us in Deuteronomy 23, mishum shene'emar lo yavot tzu adaka. The Torah tells us that that should not be part of the congregation of the Lord. V'isal kadatach, if you mean to say, chayavei lavin midoraita וחליצה רמיה לייבום לא רמיה, so those who act in a manner of chalitza, they apply to those who have negative commandment by the biblical term, but not for the ייבום. Im ba'alu amaykanu, if they have a manner of cohabitation, why you tell me that it's a manner of the final transaction? אלא מרבה אלמנה מן האירוסין נמי עשה ולא תעשהו. We say that if she's widow because of the past manner of engagement, that considering a positive and negative commandment together. דכתיב, the Torah said in Leviticus 21, קדושים יהיו לאלוהיהם. The Torah said that they should sanctify themselves to the Lord, which means that Kohen Gadol that married a widow from that manner of engagement, betrothed, he violated a Torah commandment to be holy, to sanctify himself, and therefore Kohen Gadol cannot act in a manner of ייבום. Why? Because ein aseh, positive commandment, override lo ta'aseh ve'aseh. That's the last part of the Mishnah. Said in chapter 11, you should be holy. I'm sorry, we have to run, I see all the signal of time. This is rabbinic decree. The same manner you impose upon widow from the engagement part to the widow from the total marriage. Because the one is aseh, vehu isha b'btulei ikach, the Kohen has to take a virgin one by the biblical term, and lo ta'aseh is a negative commandment of a widow. So even she is a widow from the engagement, she allowed to have the ייבום by the biblical term. The sages came in and put a boundary and said that you should not do it, because if you allow that, then the next step will be to have an act of ייבום for almana min hanisuin. ממזר נתונה מעיקה למימר, גזרה במקום מצווה, עטו שלא במקום מצווה. אלא מעתה, אשת אחיו מאביו שלא תתייבם, גזרה משום אשת אחיו מאמו. So you should uproot the total mitzvah of ייבום, because we say that it applies to the wife of the father, of the brother from his father. But how about the wife of the brother from his mother, which is a different category? So the Gemara said, Rava responded, ריבום בנחלה תליה רחמנה. So the Torah depend upon the mitzvah ייבום for the mitzvah of inheritance. מידע ידיע. It's well known that this mitzvah of Levites is not applied for the brothers from their mother, that they not inherited, biblically speaking, each other, and therefore they're not mistaken in that manner. Isha she'en la banim lo titiyabem. If a woman, their husband doesn't have a son, she cannot act in a Levite marriage. Gzera mishum isha sheyesh la banim, which means then the brother will be in a violation with Leviticus 18 of the wife of the brother. So therefore, this wife cannot ever be Levite. So they said, "Bevanim tala rachmana," which is the Torah said, "Umet echad mem ve'uben lo meida yadia." It's well known, so people are not mistaken that. Eshet achiv shaya bo lamo lo tityabem. The wife of the brother that he was alive, she should not act in the manner of Levite. Gzera mishum eshet achiv shaya bo lamo. So you may put a decree over the other. So it be shiva rachmana meida yadia. We talk that the manner of the writing in the Torah, ki yeshvu achim yachdav, applies that they know each other. They are in the living life with each other. So there's a manner of well known. And therefore, the Gemara asks another question. Kol anashim lo tityabemna. All women should not be taken in ייבום. Why? Gzera mishum ailonit. You may say that they have a decree that ought to be enacted because of the possibility that an ordinary woman might be confused with the ailonit, which a woman cannot have children. Thus, it will be impossible for ייבום ever to take place. So the Gemara said, lo shchicha. That's very uncommon. So the Gemara asked, mamzer ntunan amer lo shchicha. That's illegitimated relationship, etc. It's not so common. Lama Rava, Gzera biya rishona, atu biya shniya. You have to differentiate between the chayavei lavin, and then the next step is a violation of Torah. Lo talnameache im baalu kanu bebiya rishona vasu lekaman biya shniya. So if it's already matter of fact, so they have acquired them as a wife in the first act of cohabitation, but it's prohibited for them to keep the woman and engage in a second act of cohabitation. So, הדר אמר רבא ויתם רבא, שילב מילתא ודא אמרי, ואמר יש לקיש, כל מקום שאתה מוצא עשה ולא תעשה, אם אתה יכול לקיים שניהם מוטב, ואם לאו יבוא עשה וידחה לא תעשה. The positive will override the negative. הכנמי אפשר בחליצה דמקיים עשה ולא תעשה. So, מיטיבי, so we ask, so if you have the יבמות that fall before men, that they're prohibited to because of negative commandment, ve'im ba'alu kanu. So he said if it's already after the fact, that if the man cohabited with these Yevamot, they have acquired them as a wife. Since the man acquired a woman through the cohabitation, this must be considered a valid act of ייבום under the biblical law. So the Gemara said, Tshuvta, it's a very serious question. It's a refutation of Rava, a retraction. So now you see a very lucid way that the Torah law, the positive commandment of ייבום, does override the prohibition. So therefore the reason for ייבום should not initially be done because of the rabbinic decree, as Rava explained previously.
לשולוים מלאכי השולוים מלאכי